1942. Summer and autumn set the conditions for the encirclement at Stalingrad. After the spring successes in Crimea and Kharkiv, the German High Command redirected its main effort to the south under the plan known as Case Blue. Army Group B moved toward the Volga to cut Soviet transport routes through Stalingrad, while Army Group A advanced into the Caucasus for oil. By September, 6th Army, supported by elements of 4th Panzer Army, was fighting inside the city along a frontage pressed against the Volga embankment. The urban battle consumed infantry and ammunition and fixed German mobile formations in street fighting. To hold an overextended line hundreds of kilometers long, the German command delegated large sectors north and south of Stalingrad to Allied armies. Romanian Third Army on the Don to the north, and Romanian Fourth Army on the Kalmyk steppe to the south. This allocation created a strong centre with 6th Army and comparatively weaker flanks. The Allied contingents differed in equipment and doctrine from the formations that had led the 1941 offensive. Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies held long open sectors with limited anti-tank capability, relying heavily on 37mm and 47mm guns and few 75mm pieces. Their armoured component included 2 R tanks and small numbers of German vehicles. German 22nd Panzer Division and 1st Romanian Armoured Division were present, but understrength and dispersed. German reserves near the threatened flanks were modest. 48th Panzer Corps headquarters north of the city had little armour immediately available. South of Stalingrad, 57th Panzer Corps mixed German and Romanian units to cover a wide steppe where manoeuvre space favoured an attacker with concentrated armour. Luftwaffe resources were engaged in direct support over the city and in interdiction along the Volga, reducing flexibility for rapid response along the outer arc. Supply and distance compounded the imbalance. The drive from the Don to the Volga lengthened German truck columns and strained railheads that lay far to the west. Petroleum, oil, and lubricants, engineer bridging material, and winter clothing competed for transport space as temperatures fell below freezing in November. The Volga remained a Soviet artery for ferrying ammunition and reinforcements to the East Bank, despite German artillery and air attacks. Inside the city, 6th Army suffered attrition and requested infantry replacements, while on the flanks, Romanian divisions stretched thin to maintain continuous lines and fieldworks in open ground, with shallow anti-tank ditches and limited mines. Soviet High Command evaluated these vulnerabilities while rebuilding operational capability lost in 1941. Pre-war theorists had argued for deep operations that combined shock, armour exploitation, and encirclement. Despite purges that removed many authors of that theory, staff instruction and field experience in 1941 to 1942 preserved its core principles: massed artillery to rupture a front, mobile groups to penetrate to operational depth, and converging thrusts to close a ring. Through the summer of 1942, Stavka reconstituted tank corps and formed shock groupings within several fronts. By mid-autumn, Southwestern Front under Nikolai Vatutin, Don Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky, and Stalingrad Front under Andrei Yeremenko prepared for a double envelopment designed to avoid the urban strongpoint and strike the flanks. Planning responsibility rested with Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky as Stavka coordinators. They oversaw force assembly west of the Don and on the steppe south of the city. The Northern Striking Force massed rifle divisions, tank corps, and cavalry in the sector of Romanian Third Army near Serafimovich and Kletskaya. The Southern Group assembled near Tundutovo and Beketovka opposite Romanian Fourth Army. Artillery grouping emphasized density over short breakthrough fronts, with multiple regimental and divisional artillery echelons and Guards mortar units arranged to suppress anti-tank strongpoints and cut command lines. air armies were tasked to isolate the battlefield by striking crossings and junctions beyond the immediate front. Intelligence and deception measures supported this concentration. Fronts used night rail movements, camouflage of gun parks and tank lagers, and radio silence to conceal approach marches. Demonstrations near the city maintained the impression of a continued frontal struggle for individual factories and blocks. Reconnaissance detachments probed Romanian positions to map gun locations, while prisoner interrogations and intercepted traffic refined estimates of enemy reserves. By early November, Soviet staff assessments concluded that the sectors held by Romanian armies, though numerically substantial in infantry, lacked depth, armour, and anti-tank density to absorb a massed combined arms assault. The chosen axes exploited river crossing sites, soft ground corridors, and road nets leading to the German rear near Kalak and Sovetski. German intelligence registered Soviet movements, but interpreted them through the prism of the ongoing city battle. The expectation of continued attrition warfare inside Stalingrad led to a distribution of effort that prioritized street fighting and local relief actions along the Volga bank. Orders emphasized holding ground and preventing Soviet river link-ups rather than elastic defense on the outer arc. The prospect of a major offensive across the Don steppe in deteriorating weather was considered, but the available armoured reserve was not concentrated against a single threat axis. High Command directives discouraged withdrawals that might abandon hard-won positions in the city. Civilian conditions along the Don and in the rear zones reflected the protracted campaign. Villages near planned breakthrough sectors had been depopulated or militarized by months of occupation and front proximity. Field hospitals and depots occupied schoolhouses and collective farm buildings. As November advanced, snow cover and early thaws alternated, affecting trafficability and making concealment both easier and harder in different hours of the same day. These environmental factors influenced artillery sighting, mine placement, and logistical timing for both sides. Force totals in the region mirrored these strategic choices. Across the 3 Soviet fronts designated for the encirclement, manpower exceeded 1 million, with several hundred tanks in operational groups and a high concentration of guns and mortars along the chosen breach sectors. Axis strength around Stalingrad included 6th Army and parts of 4th Panzer Army within and near the city, supported on the flanks by Romanian armies numbering several corps with divisional frontages that averaged dozens of kilometres. The disparity did not lie solely in headcounts, but in the distribution of anti-tank weapons, armour density per kilometre, depth of defensive echelons, and the availability of mobile reserves positioned for counterstrike. By the second week of November, the geometry of the front offered an encirclement opportunity, if simultaneous breakthroughs could be achieved north and south, and if exploitation units could reach the Don crossings and the rear of German corps in the city sector before a relief concentration could form. Within this frame, the 4-day period in late November would not begin a new battle so much as activate preparations months in the making. The alignment of overstretched flanks, fixed urban fighting, doctrinal recovery, and concealed massing of artillery and armour defined the starting point from which both commands would act. Before dawn on 19th November 1942, Soviet artillery units along the Don River received the coded signal Sirius. At 7:30 local time, thousands of guns opened fire in one of the most concentrated bombardments on the Eastern Front to date. For nearly an hour, 3,500 artillery pieces, mortars and rocket launchers blanketed Romanian Third Army positions near Serafimovich and Kletskaya. The barrage targeted command posts, telephone exchanges, and anti-tank batteries to disrupt coordination before the infantry and tanks advanced. Visibility was reduced by mist and snow. Shock groups used this cover to move forward into the shattered Romanian front line. Behind the rifle divisions followed Soviet 1st Guards, 26th and 5th Tank Corps, with supporting mechanized brigades tasked to penetrate to the operational rear. The Romanian defense dissolved quickly under the combined effect of heavy fire and armor concentration. Units such as the Romanian 14th Infantry Division reported gaps of several kilometers after the first hour. Anti-tank guns were overwhelmed by Soviet T-34 and KV tanks, against which 37mm and 47mm shells proved ineffective at long range. Communications with German liaison staffs broke down as telephone cables were cut and radio operators abandoned posts. The few German elements in the sector, including the 22nd Panzer Division, attempted to counterattack but encountered technical failures. Many tanks immobilized by frost-cracked fuel lines and mechanical neglect after months in the steppe. By noon, Soviet armored columns were advancing 15 to 20 kilometers beyond the initial front. To the south, the second blow began on November 20th. Stalingrad Front's 57th and 51st Armies attacked the Romanian 4th Army along the Kotelnikovo-Beketovka axis. The pattern repeated, a short, violent artillery preparation followed by tank infantry assaults in deep snow. Romanian 1st Armoured Division and elements of 29th German Motorized Division attempted to form blocking groups but were rapidly enveloped. Within the first day, Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps broke through towards Sovetski, threatening to join with northern forces, advancing through Kalash. The coordination between both pincers was facilitated by prearranged radio schedules and air reconnaissance that reported the collapse of Romanian resistance and the widening corridor through the Axis rear. The German High Command learned of the northern breakthrough by late afternoon on the 19th, but underestimated its scale. Reports from 6th Army headquarters described localized Romanian setbacks, and Army Group B commander General Maximilian von Weichs ordered 48th Panzer Corps to stabilize the situation north of Stalingrad. However, the Corps lacked sufficient tanks, barely 30 operational vehicles, and was already engaged in defensive actions along the Don. South of the city, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army faced similar constraints, with mobile divisions scattered between the Volga front and the steppe. Adolf Hitler's directive to hold fast in Stalingrad precluded large withdrawals that might have shortened the line and freed reserves. As the offensive expanded, Soviet fronts exploited the momentum rather than consolidating. Forward detachments bypassed resistance nodes to seize crossings and junctions. By 21st November, 26th Tank Corps captured Perelazovsky and advanced toward Kalash on the Don, while 4th Mechanized Corps from the south moved along the Abganerovo-Sovetski road. The distances between the two spearheads narrowed rapidly, within 40 kilometers by the morning of the 22nd. The steppe terrain, though frozen and swept by wind, offered clear visibility and allowed armored columns to maintain movement despite broken bridges. Supply columns followed with fuel drums and ammunition sleds to sustain the pursuit. Inside Stalingrad, General Friedrich Paulus continued operations under the assumption that Soviet attacks aimed merely to relieve the city garrison. Reports from the Romanian fronts arrived piecemeal and lacked coherence. The German 6th Army fielded roughly 20 divisions, but most were tied to block-by-block fighting along the Volga and lacked transport to disengage rapidly. Paulus proposed limited withdrawals from the city perimeter to form a shorter defensive arc, but authorization required Hitler's approval through Army Group headquarters. The delay proved critical. By the evening of November 22nd, Soviet armored vanguards reached the Don near Kalash, where a bridgehead was held by German engineer units guarding the vital crossing. At dawn on 23rd November, Soviet 26th Tank Corps captured the bridge at Kalash almost intact. A detachment led by Colonel Filipov's tanks entered the town from the northwest, while 4th Mechanized Corps approached from the south. The two forces linked near Sovetski around 4 p.m., completing the encirclement. Approximately 22 German and Romanian divisions, around 290,000 personnel, found themselves enclosed in an area roughly 50 by 40 kilometers. with the Volga on one side and Soviet armies forming a continuous ring. Within hours, German communications with the outside world were limited to radio contact through the airlift base at Tatsinskaya. The speed of the Soviet advance owed much to planning discipline and operational coordination achieved since earlier failures. Unlike the chaotic winter counteroffensives of 1941 to 42, Operation Uranus synchronized artillery, armor, and infantry across multiple fronts. Zhukov and Vasilevsky's supervision ensured that objectives, Don crossings, road junctions, supply dumps, were assigned with precision and supported by reconnaissance. Engineering units bridged rivers under fire. Air armies maintained near-continuous sorties despite weather. The emphasis on operational depth, using successive echelons to exploit breakthroughs rather than halt after the first success, reflected the practical application of pre-war doctrine resurrected under wartime conditions. For the Axis command, the encirclement introduced a strategic dilemma. 6th Army still held the ruins of Stalingrad and large ammunition and food stocks within the city, but all land routes were cut. Withdrawal westward could have been possible on the 21st to the 22nd of November when only mobile groups blocked the corridor, yet no order to retreat was given. The assumption that the pocket could be supplied by air, combined with Hitler's insistence on holding positions along the Volga, defined the next phase of the campaign. Within 4 days, the German summer offensive that had begun with the aim of seizing the Caucasus ended with the isolation of its strongest field army on the banks of the Volga, transforming the southern front of the war. The completion of the encirclement on 23 November 1942 transformed the entire strategic landscape of the Eastern Front. What had begun as a limited Soviet counteroffensive to relieve pressure at Stalingrad now threatened to destroy one of Germany's principal armies in the field. The German 6th Army and parts of 4th Panzer Army were trapped within a vast pocket extending from the Volga River to the Don Steppe, its perimeter encircled by the Don, Stalingrad, and southwestern fronts. Inside the ring were not only German formations, but also Romanian, Croatian, and support units, logistics columns, field hospitals, and thousands of wounded who could not be evacuated in time. The encircled force had roughly 10 to 12 days of rations and limited fuel. Ammunition stocks were substantial but unevenly distributed, concentrated in depots near the city centre and along the Volga bank. German High Command reacted within hours of confirmation. On the evening of 23 November, General Kurt Seitzler, Chief of the Army General Staff, briefed Adolf Hitler at Rastenburg. Field reports indicated the pocket's closure, but Hitler refused to authorize an immediate breakout. Instead, he demanded that 6th Army hold its positions until relief could arrive. The decision was influenced by Hermann Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled force by air. Göring cited the precedent of the Demyansk airlift earlier that year, where an isolated German corps had been sustained for months. However, the scale was incomparably larger at Stalingrad. Demyansk had required about 270 tons of supplies per day, whereas 6th Army needed at least 600 tons simply to maintain combat readiness. Winter weather, distance from air bases, and Soviet air defences made such an operation logistically improbable. Soviet command was fully aware that a massive encirclement required immediate consolidation. While frontline troops celebrated the closing of the ring, Stavka's orders emphasized the necessity of tightening the encirclement before any breakout attempt could occur. On the 24th to the 25th of November, units from the 21st, 65th, and 24th Armies pressed inward from the north, while 57th and 51st Armies moved from the south and east. The two Soviet fronts formed successive belts of defense, an inner ring to contain 6th Army and an outer ring to repel any German relief from the west. Each belt consisted of rifle divisions, artillery, and tank brigades positioned at road intersections and commanding elevations. Between these rings lay step zones patrolled by cavalry and mobile detachments to intercept airdropped supplies or fleeing groups. The encircled German forces reorganized rapidly under extreme pressure. Paulus established his command post in the department store basement on Stalingrad's central square. Communications within the pocket were unreliable. Field telephones often failed, and radio traffic had to be limited to prevent Soviet interception. Corps and divisional commanders attempted to create coherent defensive sectors, linking remnants of shattered units. The front now faced outward instead of toward the Volga. Infantry divisions that had previously fought in the city were pulled back to defensive lines along the northern and southern shoulders of the pocket. Fuel shortages immediately affected mobility. Many artillery tractors and trucks were drained to refuel the few remaining tanks, reducing the ability to maneuver heavy guns. Snowstorms and freezing temperatures worsened conditions for both men and machinery. For Romanian survivors of the initial assault, the situation was catastrophic. Scattered remnants of 3rd and 4th Armies retreated westward in disorder, leaving behind thousands of prisoners and abandoned guns. Reports from German liaison officers estimated that nearly 75% of Romanian personnel on the Stalingrad flanks were killed, captured, or missing within the first week. The collapse of these armies also disrupted the German logistical network. Depots, fuel trains, and repair facilities were either overrun or destroyed during retreat. Soviet units captured immense quantities of material, over 1,000 guns, several hundred tanks and armoured vehicles, and tens of thousands of rifles and ammunition crates. These spoils reinforced the image of a massive operational victory and boosted morale across the Red Army. Meanwhile, German field commands west of the Don attempted to organise a relief. Army Group Don was created under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein on the 24th of November by merging the remnants of Army Group B's southern forces with newly arriving units from reserve. Manstein's mission was twofold: stabilise the front between the Don and Chir rivers and prepare for an operation to reopen a corridor to the 6th Army. The main striking force would be 4th Panzer Army, reinforced by 57th Panzer Corps and several divisions from the Caucasus. Yet, the regrouping would take weeks, and available units were scattered across hundreds of kilometers. Soviet reconnaissance flights observed these concentrations and relayed warnings to the Stavka, prompting the Soviets to fortify their outer ring with anti-tank ditches, minefields and mobile reserves from the 2nd Guards Army. Within the Stalingrad pocket, daily life descended into a routine of deprivation. Soldiers slept in dugouts or cellars, insulated with straw and canvas. Food rations declined rapidly. A soldier might receive 200 grams of bread, a few spoonfuls of canned meat, and frozen horseflesh when available. Water was obtained by melting snow. Medical facilities overflowed, and frostbite became as lethal as Soviet artillery. Airlift deliveries began on November 25th from airfields at Tatsinskaya, Morozovsk, and Novocherkassk. But weather and Soviet fighters limited the number of flights. On average, fewer than 100 tons reached the pocket per day, barely 1/6 of the required quantity. Junkers Ju-52 and Hu-111 transport aircraft flying in darkness and snow faced heavy losses. Many were destroyed on landing or by ground fire. Nevertheless, the airlift continued under Hitler's explicit order, creating one of the most extensive but futile logistical efforts of the war. Soviet leadership monitored these developments closely. Zhukov and Vasilevsky insisted that the encircled enemy not be attacked immediately, but exhausted through blockade and attrition. The Soviet command remembered the costly frontal assaults at Vyazma and Rzhev, where encircled German forces had resisted for months. Instead, they prioritized securing the Don-Volga corridor and preparing for expected German counterattacks from the west. The Red Army established supply depots, repaired captured rail lines, and positioned field airstrips closer to the front. Engineers reinforced bridges over the Don to facilitate redeployment of heavy artillery and tanks. Despite the triumph, logistical challenges remained immense. Roads were frozen, vehicles lacked maintenance, and the temperature fell below -25°C at night. By the end of November 1942, the situation around Stalingrad had stabilized into a new configuration. Inside the pocket, an encircled army relying on air supply and short reserves. Outside, Soviet forces organizing to repel any rescue attempt. For both sides, the coming weeks would test their capacity to sustain large-scale operations under winter conditions. The rapid Soviet victory of 4 days had set the stage for a prolonged siege that would define the remainder of the campaign and determine the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. The operational design that produced the encirclement had been assembled over 8 weeks, with planning phases that shifted from concept to detailed tables of organization and fire plans. In mid-September 1942, Stavka assigned Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky to survey the Stalingrad theatre and report on feasible counterstrokes. Their memorandum recommended a double envelopment executed by 2 shock groupings, each centered on a combined arms army reinforced with tank and mechanized corps, converging on the Don crossings at Kalach and the road junctions south of the city. The target was not the city itself, but the operational rear of 6th Army. Don Front, Stalingrad Front, and Southwestern Front were designated to provide the echelons, rifle divisions to breach, artillery to suppress anti-tank belts, and mobile groups to exploit to a depth of 70 to 120 kilometers. Force generation followed a strict schedule. Between late September and early November, 4 tank corps and 2 mechanized corps were rebuilt or transferred into the theatre. Among them, 1st Guards, 4th, 5th, and 26th Tank Corps, 4th and 13th Mechanized Corps. A typical tank corps fielded 3 tank brigades and 1 motorized rifle brigade, totaling 120 to 180 tanks depending on delivery. T-34s and T-70s predominated. Heavy KV tanks were held in smaller numbers in independent guards units. Mechanized Corps comprised 3 mechanized brigades with integral tank regiments, providing stronger infantry and artillery components for holding captured ground. Artillery assets included multiple guards mortar regiments with M13 and M31 rockets, breakthrough artillery regiments with 122mm and 152mm guns, and anti-tank regiments with 57mm ZIS-2 guns. Artillery density along the chosen 30 to 40 kilometer breach sectors was raised to 100 to 150 tubes per kilometer when mortars were counted with timed rolling lifts calculated to minutes and hundreds of meters. Logistics tables matched the operational depth. Front Supply Administration stockpiled 3 to 5 basic loads of artillery ammunition forward of the Don, and 400 to 600 tons of fuel per corps in forward depots disguised as haystacks and threshing floors. Engineer units assembled prefabricated bridge elements and ice tools for November conditions, assigning bridging companies to each axis. Field railways on the east bank of the Volga were repaired to move ammunition to ferry slips opposite Stalingrad and to crossing points near Surovikino and Kachelinskaya. Air Armies 2 and 16 were tasked to interdict German roads west of the Don and suppress identified anti-aircraft positions during the opening bombardment. Concealment relied on layered deception. Maskirovka directives forbade daytime road movements of armour within 40 kilometres of the front. Tanks were parked under reed mats and in ravines. Exhaust was dispersed through trenches to avoid thermal plumes on frosty mornings. Dummy artillery parks with wooden barrels and fake ammunition crates were erected near secondary sectors to draw reconnaissance. Radio networks were split. Radio silence on the main axes. Simulated traffic near the Volga city centre to reinforce the impression that the decisive effort remained inside Stalingrad. Small-scale attacks and patrol clashes continued in the ruins to maintain a steady rhythm of reports reaching German observers. Partisan detachments in the Kalach and Kotelnikovo hinterlands cut telephone lines, forcing German staffs to rely on couriers, which delayed higher headquarters assessments by hours. Intelligence collation was continuous. Reconnaissance in force identified the structure of Romanian Third Army north of the city. 2 corps holding a 140-kilometre front with divisional sectors of 20 to 30 kilometres, limited depth, and anti-tank densities, in some stretches, under 6 to 8 guns per kilometre. Prisoner interrogations and captured paperwork quantified ammunition deficits and shortages of winter gear. South of Stalingrad, Romanian Fourth Army's centre and right relied on river lines with few prepared fallback positions. German 48th Panzer Corps headquarters was present behind Romanian Third Army, but its armour strength was assessed as under 50 operational tanks in mid-November. Luftwaffe airfields were mapped at Tatsinskaya, Morozovsk, and Oblivskaya, with runway lengths and dispersal areas plotted for later interdiction. German and Romanian planning moved on a different premise. For Army Group B, the city battle remained the dominant mission. In October, 6th Army reported street-by-street advances and requested infantry replacements and sappers. Romanian command reported repeated Soviet probes, but assessed them as routine. Intelligence summaries noted Soviet rail traffic increases across the Volga, but linked them to replacements for the city front. The German defensive concept relied on holding strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire and mobile reserves to seal breaches. However, reserve grouping was thin. 22nd Panzer Division suffered maintenance problems. 1st Romanian Armoured Division fielded around 90 to 100 tanks, many R2 models with 37mm guns ill-suited against T-34 frontal armour at standard engagement ranges. Doctrine shaped expectations. Soviet staffs revived pre-war deep operation frameworks by enforcing echelons, a shock echelon to rupture tactical zones, an exploitation echelon of tanks and mechanized troops to reach operational objectives, and a reserve echelon to expand the breach and form an outer ring. Liaison officers enforced timetable discipline, limiting exploitation halts to refuel and cross rivers in hours rather than days. German doctrine emphasized flexible defense and counterattack by armor concentrated at decisive points, but the necessary mass was fixed in the urban fight, or dispersed along wide flanks. Orders from higher command to maintain the Volga front restricted the option to trade space on the outer arc to assemble a larger counterstrike group. Weather calculations were built into both plans. Soviet meteorological reports projected low clouds, fog, and intermittent snow between November 18th and 22nd, conditions that would limit German aerial reconnaissance and complicate interdiction of artillery positions. Frozen ground would carry tanks, while early thaws would be short. Bridging schedules assumed ice crusts would hinder river current, but not yet support heavy vehicles, making capture of intact crossings at Kalash and around Sovetski a priority. Luftwaffe daily serviceability logs anticipated a decline under freezing conditions, with dicing fluids and heated hangars in short supply at forward bases. Command arrangements were clarified to prevent delays at the moment of decision. Vasilevsky coordinated the northern pincer across southwestern and Don front boundaries. Zhukov supervised the southern strike and the later formation of inner and outer rings. Boundary lines were adjusted to keep entire road nets and bridges under a single front's authority. Artillery commanders received authority to shift fires across neighbouring armies during the preparation without further approval. Tank Corps commanders were given reconnaissance groups with radios to contact frontal aviation for immediate strikes on road columns or bridges identified during advance. The result of these preparations was not an improvised blow, but a sequence designed to move from breach to envelopment in 4 days if regimental objectives were met within assigned hours. This schedule depended on multiple conditional events, neutralizing anti-tank hubs, preventing timely concentration of 48th Panzer Corps, and seizing the Don bridges before demolition, each supported by specific measures in the plan. Where earlier winter offensives of 1941 had outrun supply and lost cohesion, the Uranus timetable linked ammunition expenditure, refueling, and engineer tasks to route segments and time windows. In the same period, Axis plans lacked a theatre-level scheme to absorb a two-front breach on extended flanks while holding Stalingrad, leaving responses to corps-level improvisation. When the guns opened on November 19th, both systems were tested against the terrain, the season, and the arithmetic of men, guns, and kilometers that their staffs had compiled in the weeks before. The closure of the ring created simultaneous crises on the battlefield, in logistics, and in command. On 24 November 1942, the encircled grouping standardized defensive sectors facing outward, while Soviet armies reorganized into two belts. The inner containment ring combined rifle divisions with attached anti-tank regiments positioned at road nodes around Gumrak, Marinovka, and the northern shoulder near Orlovka. The outer shield extended along the Don and Chir rivers, and south across the steppe to the Aksai and Mishkova. Southwestern, Don and Stalingrad fronts rotated fresh units into blocking positions and concentrated mobile reserves behind probable relief axes. Ammunition columns, now operating on frozen roads, established dumps within 20 to 30 kilometers of the expected battlefields to reduce resupply time if a German counterstroke formed west of the pocket. German command restructured its theatre to meet the emergency. On 24 November, the new Army Group Don under Erich von Manstein assumed control of 4th Panzer Army, elements withdrawn from the Caucasus, and the remnants along the Chir. The immediate tasks were to seal the Soviet bridgeheads on the Chir, prevent a Soviet advance toward Rostov that might cut the entire southern wing, and form a relief group aimed at reopening a corridor to the pocket. The force initially available for the Western Screen included the 11th Panzer Division and ad hoc battle groups formed from infantry, engineers, and flak units. Farther south, 57th Panzer Corps began assembling near Kotelnikovo, with 6th Panzer Division arriving by rail from France, supported by 23rd Panzer Division and elements of the 17th Panzer Division as they detrained. Distances were long. Kotelnikovo lay roughly 150 to 180 kilometers from the pocket's southern edge, and every move depended on scant fuel stocks and single-track rail lines vulnerable to interdiction. Inside the pocket, the arithmetic of supply set the pace. Daily requirements calculated by 6th Army staffs exceeded 600 tons for ammunition, fuel, and rations. The minimum to maintain basic combat capability was assessed at 300 to 350 tons. Luftwaffe transport groups operating from Morozovsk and Tatsinskaya began regular sorties on the 25th of November with Ju-52s and He-100s 11s. Weather reduced serviceability. Night flying and icing affected landing rates at Pitomnik and Gumrak. During the last week of November, the average delivery rarely exceeded 100 tons per day, with fluctuations depending on wind and fog. Losses mounted from fighter interception and ground fire, and turnaround slowed as snow forced repeated runway maintenance. The gap between requirement and delivery meant fuel was rationed to artillery tractors and a few tanks. Many vehicles were cannibalized to keep a smaller fleet mobile. The airlift's limits shaped operational choices. Two concepts circulated in German headquarters: an immediate breakout westward while the Soviet ring was still forming, and a relief thrust from outside to meet the pocket, after which the encircled force would withdraw along a narrow corridor. The breakout plan, referred to in staff discussions as Donnerschlag, required 6th Army to abandon the Volga bank and move toward the Chir with whatever fuel remained, likely enough for a one-time march of several dozen kilometers. Hitler's order of 24th to 25th November to hold Stalingrad pending relief removed the first option. Paulus's staff compiled fuel and ammunition ledgers that showed the trade-off. Moving the entire army risked immobilizing artillery and medical columns after the first day. Staying in place preserved heavy weapons and stocks, but consumed supplies without altering the geometry of the front. On the Soviet side, escalation took a different form. Stavka authorized the creation of an operational reserve against a relief attempt. By early December, 2nd Guards Army, transferred from the strategic reserve, began sliding toward the Mishkova sector behind Stalingrad front. Its rifle corps and attached artillery provided a dense anti-tank line designed to meet any massed panzer attack from Kotelnikovo. Meanwhile, Southwestern Front launched operations west of the Don to widen the outer ring and deny Manstein the use of the Chir River as an assembly barrier. The fighting there between 26 November and 7th December centered on bridgeheads near Nizhnochirskaya and Surovikino. German 11th Panzer Division, with roughly 80 to 100 runners at any given time, executed repeated counterattacks to eliminate crossings and restore the river line. Soviet armies pressed with multiple rifle divisions and tank brigades, seeking to expand lodgements to road depth. Each side measured progress in kilometers of riverbank gained or lost, and in the number of intact bridges held at dusk. Crisis management also unfolded in communications. Radio networks in the pocket and at Army Group Don had to balance encryption practices against the need for speed. Intercepts and direction finding by Soviet radio intelligence plotted frequencies and call signs, helping fronts anticipate where airlift peaks would concentrate and where relief columns would form. Night harassment aviation targeted Morozovsk and Tatsinskaya dispersal areas to interrupt loading schedules. In turn, German flak guns redeployed to cover approach lanes over the pocket's airfields, consuming ammunition at rates that required priority in air-delivered loads. Each decision on the ground generated a corresponding adjustment in the supply tables for the next 24 hours. Weather compounded the crisis by imposing predictable yet unavoidable constraints. Temperatures in late November fell well below freezing at night and often climbed near zero during daylight, creating alternating ice and mud on secondary tracks. Frozen lubricants slowed artillery traverse. Infantry spent hours on maintenance of weapons and footwear to prevent malfunctions and frostbite. For air operations, morning fogs delayed first sorties until noon, compressing the daily schedule into short windows. On the ground, Soviet engineers used the freeze to strengthen minbelts and anti-tank ditches in the Mishkova and Aksai sectors. German pioneers blasted ice to keep the Chir fordable in selected places for counterattacks. Civilian populations in the surrounding steppe experienced the escalation as a cycle of a requisition and displacement. Columns of refugees moved along the same roads as ammunition convoys. Soviet authorities organized emergency bread and fuel distributions in recaptured villages. German rear services evacuated administrative personnel from the Chir Valley ahead of Soviet probes. Field hospitals on both sides filled with frostbite and trench foot cases that rose in proportion to combat wounds as the siege conditions settled. By the first week of December, the crisis had stabilized into clearly defined lines of effort. For Manstein, the decisive axis would run from Kotelnikovo to the Mishkova and then toward the southwestern edge of the pocket, a march of over 120 kilometers, requiring a breakthrough against prepared anti-tank belts. For Paulus, the key question was timing, whether to coordinate any movement with the relief thrust or continue to hold static sectors to conserve fuel. For the Soviet fronts, the task was to hold the inner ring while concentrating sufficient artillery and reserves on the likely relief axis, and at the same time prepare broader operations west of the Don to commit German reserves elsewhere. The escalation in late November did not produce immediate resolution, but it defined the constraints, distance, tonnage, temperature, and time that would govern the decisive encounters planned for mid-December. On 12 December 1942, the relief operation from Kotelnikovo began. The striking force, 57th Panzer Corps, under Friedrich Kirchner, assembled around 6th Panzer Division with approximately 100 serviceable tanks, followed by the 23rd Panzer Division and advanced elements of the 17th Panzer Division. Command lay with 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hof, subordinated to Army Group Don. The axis of advance led north along the rail and road line through Nebikov and the Aksai Valley toward the Mishkova River, a distance of roughly 120 to 150 kilometers to the southwestern edge of the pocket. Opposite them, Stalingrad Front initially deployed formations from 51st Army and 57th Army. Stavka directed 2nd Guards Army to close on the Mishkova as a mobile counterweight once the German thrust revealed its main effort. The first engagement centered on river crossings. German assault groups seized bridges over the Aksai on December 12th to 13th, using concentrated artillery and 88mm flak to suppress Soviet strongpoints. Rapid demolition parties cleared obstacles on the approaches. Engineers threw additional trestles for supply columns. Soviet anti-tank companies with 45mm and 57mm guns contested the fords, but were pushed back by combined tank and infantry attacks. Air support fluctuated with weather. The Luftwaffe flew close support when cloud ceilings allowed, while Soviet aviation targeted bridges and road nodes to slow the Panzer march. By 13th December, forward elements of 6th Panzer reached Verkhnekunsky, a small settlement controlling the ascent to the Mishkova Ridge. Between 13th and 15th December, the fighting around Verkhnekunsky reached maximum intensity. The locality changed hands multiple times as Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps, reinforced by tank brigades and Guards rifle units, counterattacked along the ridgeline. German battle groups anchored defenses on the village and nearby heights, rotating companies to maintain pressure. Engagement ranges were often under 800 meters due to undulating terrain and snow squalls. German reports noted the use of T-34s in packets of platoons to blunt flanking moves. Soviet accounts emphasize close artillery support from 76mm regimental guns moved forward by hand. Losses in tanks on both sides rose quickly, with recovery crews working at night to tow damaged vehicles behind the line. By the end of the 15th of December, 6th Panzer forced a passage and pushed reconnaissance toward the Mishkova, but the tempo slowed as Soviet reserves thickened. The arrival of 2nd Guards Army altered the balance. Transferred from the strategic reserve and commanded by Rodion Malinovsky, it deployed 2 rifle corps with attached anti-tank brigades and heavy artillery, and held mechanized units as counterattack forces behind the river line. Minor belts and gun lines were laid along likely crossing sites at Vasilievka and Gromoslavka. The Mishkova, shallow but bordered by steep banks and villages, offered covered fields of fire. When German columns reached the river on December 17th to 18th, they encountered layered defences. Forward outposts forced early deployment. Main anti-tank positions engaged at mid-range, and artillery concentrations struck road junctions to disrupt bridge building. While the relief thrust pressed north, the wider theatre reached its own peak. On 16th December, Southwestern Front launched Little Saturn against the Italian 8th Army along the Upper Don. Rifle divisions supported by tank corps broke through on a front of dozens of kilometers, taking river towns and threatening the rear of Army Group Don. The advance endangered Morozovsk and Tatsinskaya, hubs for the Stalingrad airlift. Manstein faced a strategic distribution problem. Maintain 57th Panzer Corps on the Mishkova in hopes of linking with 6th Army, or divert mobile formations to secure the flank against a breakthrough that could reach Rostov and cut the southern wing entirely. He chose to hold the Mishkova effort for several days while moving additional formations to the threatened sector, accepting widening risk on both axes. In the pocket, the command debate reached a culmination. Manstein sent signals indicating that a temporary opening might be possible if 6th Army attempted a breakout toward the Mishkova with available fuel. Paulus reviewed stocks and transport status. Fuel reserves were insufficient to move all heavy weapons. Any breakout would require abandoning large depots and immobile wounded. Authorization from Hitler to attempt a breakout did not arrive. Orders remained to hold positions in Stalingrad and await relief. The airlift, at times peaking around 260 to 300 tons on favorable days, did not close the daily shortfall. Pitomnik and Gumrak airfields were subjected to artillery fire, increasing unloading times and losses on the ground. At the tactical level, on the Mishkova, German attempts to force crossings encountered prepared fire plans. Anti-tank regiments with ZIS-2 57mm guns engaged from hull-down positions. Heavy batteries registered on assembly areas. German artillery, including 105mm and 150mm howitzers, tried to neutralize these belts, but ammunition had to be conserved for the sustained march. The frozen surface allowed vehicles to leave roads, yet snow concealed mine rows that caused repeated delays. For several days, distances to the pocket narrowed to under 50 to 60 kilometers by road, measured along the axis toward the southwestern corner near Marinovka. Patrols from both sides clashed in no man's land between the river and forward Soviet defensive localities, each seeking confirmation of a possible joint link-up or a gap to exploit. Civilian conditions in the Mishkova and Aksai valleys deteriorated rapidly during this phase. Villages that had seen occupation for months became immediate battle spaces. Requisitions removed food and livestock. Cellars served as aid stations. Wells froze and were reopened with explosives. Evacuations proceeded piecemeal, with families moving behind whichever force held the nearest road. Casualty stations in rear hamlets treated a rising proportion of cold injuries among combatants and civilians as night temperatures fell well below zero. Air power reached a concurrent peak. The Luftwaffe concentrated fighter cover over the Panzer Spearhead and over the airlift approaches to Pitomnik. Soviet aviation increased sorties against bridges and depots supporting the 57th Panzer Corps. Both sides reported shortages in serviceable aircraft and crews after continuous operations in freezing weather. The threat to Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk from Little Saturn created further strain as transport wings prepared contingency moves while trying to maintain daily deliveries into the pocket. Each diversion of sorties to protect bases reduced lift capacity. Each day of limited lift consumed irreplaceable stocks inside the encirclement. By 20th to 21st December, the relief force had not secured a bridgehead across the Mishkova. Soviet counterattacks, conducted by Guards rifle formations with close support from attached tank brigades, restored lost ground at several crossing attempts and pushed German forward units back to the south bank in places. Reports from 6th Panzer and 23rd Panzer recorded diminishing tank numbers due to combat, mechanical attrition, and the need to allocate vehicles to protect flanks against increasing Soviet probes westward from the Don Bend. The cumulative effect of Little Saturn now forced Manstein to release units from the Kotelnikovo axis to stabilize the Chir and rear areas. The relief thrust, still short of the pocket, began to lose mass. The peak phase therefore produced maximum commitment from both commands without decisive resolution. The German effort from Kotelnikovo advanced over 100 kilometers and closed to within operational reach, but did not open a corridor. The Soviet defense on the Mishkova held with a combination of pre-positioned anti-tank belts, artillery control, and timely reinforcement, while the concurrent offensive on the Upper Don altered the strategic equation by threatening the relief forces' base and the airlift's airfields. Inside Stalingrad, 6th Army's situation continued to deteriorate despite occasional days of higher air deliveries, as fuel and medical supplies declined and the perimeter tightened. The culmination on the Mishkova set the conditions for subsequent decisions, whether to renew the relief attempt, order a breakout, or shift to a strategy aimed at inflicting wider operational damage on Axis forces west of the Don. Adaptation on both sides followed immediately after the relief thrusts stalled on the Mishkova. In the Stalingrad pocket, 6th Army regrouped for outward-facing defense while conserving remaining fuel. On December 22nd to 24th, 1942, Paulus reorganized sectors under the 14th Panzer Corps in the south and the 51st Army Corps in the north, aligning boundaries with terrain features and road nets to simplify logistics. Divisions assembled composite battalions by merging depleted regiments. Artillery groups standardized loads for direct fire against tanks. Ammunition expenditure tables set daily ceilings for 105mm and 150mm howitzers and for infantry guns, with priority to counter-battery and airfield defense. Fuel allotments reduced vehicle movement to essential tasks, ambulances to Potomnik, ration carts to divisional kitchens, and short shuttles to reposition anti-tank guns. Workshop companies stripped damaged vehicles to keep command trucks and a limited number of tanks in service. Soviet fronts adapted their containment to prevent a coordinated breakout. Stalingrad and Don fronts built a continuous system of strongpoints around Gumrak, Marinovka, Baburkin and Orlovka, each with wire, mines and anti-tank guns sighted for crossing fires. Mobile groups, tank brigades with attached sappers, stood behind threatened sectors to close any penetration within hours. Artillery commanders shifted from initial preparatory fires to planned concentrations against likely assembly areas. Guards mortar battalions registered airfields and junctions with timed salvos to disrupt air traffic and road movements at night. Anti-aircraft units redeployed to cover Potomnik and Gumrak approaches. Forward observers used sound ranging and light signals to cue batteries against transport aircraft circles. On the outer belt, 2nd Guards Army and elements of 51st and 57th Armies thickened the Mishkova line, while Southwestern Front expanded bridgeheads on the Chir to fix German reserves. Along the Chir River, German adaptation centered on mobile defense. From 26th November through late December, 11th Panzer Division and mixed battle groups conducted rapid counterattacks to compress Soviet lodgements at Nizhne Chirskaya and Surovikino. The method relied on night marches, concentrated artillery at short notice, and immediate exploitation to retake ridge lines dominating ferry sites. Flak batteries with 88mm guns reinforced anti-tank defense where divisional guns were insufficient. Railway troops repaired demolitions under fire to shuttle ammunition forward. These actions preserved a lateral route for Army Group Don and prevented a broader Soviet rupture toward Rostov during the period when 57th Panzer Corps was engaged on the Mishkova. Inside the pocket, improvisation addressed shortages. Infantry units adopted fixed sector routines, forward posts by night, relief every few hours to reduce frostbite, and predetermined mortar stonks to break up local attacks. Medical services consolidated into larger clearing stations near Gumrak with evacuation priority for abdominal wounds and severe frostbite. Morphine and sulfur drugs were rationed. Rations declined below 200 grams of bread per day in many units by late December, supplemented by horseflesh and occasional airdropped field kitchens. Fuel for heating was produced by burning lubricants and salvaged wood. Improvised chimneys reduced smoke signature to avoid artillery spotting. Signals troops used buried cable loops and courier relays to replace cut lines, maintaining minimum traffic on radio nets, reserved for airlift coordination and priority reports. Soviet adaptation sought to convert material capture into immediate operational utility. Repair teams recovered usable trucks and guns in villages overrun during November and early December. Captured 75mm field guns were pressed into service after rapid rechambering of ammunition, where possible or used for direct fire, with limited stocks. Engineers improved road networks with corduroy surfaces across thawed patches. Horse teams supplemented trucks to move shells when fuel convoys lagged. Staffs institutionalized forward supply points, within 10 to 15 kilometers of likely battle sectors, enabling tank brigades to refuel and rearm overnight and return to position before dawn. Air armies increased low-altitude patrols over the pocket to harass unloading at Potomnik, accepting higher losses to light flak in exchange for delays that rippled through the daily schedule of transport sorties. Manstein's headquarters adapted to the dual pressure of the Mishkova battles and the widening Soviet offensive to the northwest. Reinforcements rerouted from the Caucasus were split. Units with immediate mobility joined the 57th Panzer Corps to sustain the river fight. Formations detraining farther west moved to the Upper Don to stabilize Little Saturn's breakthrough corridors. Command posts were echeloned along the rail line to maintain control while shifting divisions between axes. Fuel depots were dispersed and camouflaged to reduce losses to air attack. The choice to continue the Kotelnikovo effort for several days while diverting new arrivals to the Chir demonstrated a balancing act between the operational aim of linking to 6th Army and the strategic necessity of holding the Rostov Gateway. Airlift procedures evolved to extract more tonnage per day, despite fixed aircraft numbers. 111 bombers were reconfigured to carry cargo with floor reinforcements. Ju-52 groups adjusted loading plans to favor high-density items, cartridges, medical stores, and radio spares over bulk rations. Ground crews at Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk shortened turnaround by pre-palletizing loads. At Potomnik, unloading teams formed mixed details from various units to clear aircraft in minutes, and wounded were prioritized for outbound flights by category. Yet, operational mathematics remained unfavorable. Icing, fog, runway damage, and Soviet bombardment frequently cut the number of safe landings. When conditions permitted, daily inflow approached 250 to 300 tons. On many days, deliveries fell below 100 tons, forcing additional ration cuts and the cannibalization of artillery prime movers for fuel. Psychological adaptation shaped behavior on both sides. In the pocket, command emphasized routine and sector stability to maintain cohesion. Posted orders, set watch schedules, banned open fires, and regulated distribution to prevent disorder. Chaplains and field police reinforced discipline. Letters and leave were suspended. Among Soviet troops, the transition from the 4-day offensive to siege duties required adjustment to cold, long static watches and periodic counterattacks. Political departments circulated briefings explaining the blockade strategy and the importance of resisting any breakout, while unit clubs arranged readings and concerts in rear billets to reduce attrition from cold and fatigue. Civilians in contested villages adapted by maintaining hidden food caches and moving between dwellings when lines shifted. Local administrations restarted bread baking and repair work under military supervision where security permitted. Innovation appeared in small technical measures. German anti-tank teams increased the use of Haftolladung magnetic charges and bundled grenades in street sectors of the pocket. Soviet sappers countered by wiring approaches and illuminating with flares to deny close assaults. Soviet artillery batteries in the Mishkova sector adopted timed box barrages to isolate attempted crossings. German engineers experimented with smoke candles to veil bridge work in sub-zero winds. Patrols from both sides adjusted clothing, felt boots, layered mittens, face coverings, to reduce cold injuries, a factor that by late December matched or exceeded daily combat losses. By 22nd to 23rd December, resistance and adaptation produced a plateau. The relief force held a line short of the Mishkova crossings with diminishing offensive capacity. The pocket sustained outward defense with shrinking stocks. The Soviet rings incorporated reinforcements and improved artillery control. Each side had extracted efficiencies from its systems. Mobile counterblows on the Chir, standardized supply points, reconfigured transport aircraft, but none had solved the foundational constraints of distance, tonnage, and weather. The next phase would pivot on actions aimed not only at the pocket's perimeter, but at the infrastructure sustaining the air bridge and the relief forces west of the Don. By 23rd to 24th of December 1942, the dynamic around Stalingrad reached its critical turning point. Manstein's relief offensive from Kotelnikovo had exhausted its momentum, while Soviet fronts initiated operations to destroy the logistical system supporting both the airlift and the German defense along the Chir River. The catalyst came from the northwestern sector of the Don Bend. On 16th December, the Red Army's southwestern front had launched Operation Little Saturn, striking the Italian 8th Army and parts of German 48th Panzer Corps between the Don and Chir. The offensive quickly widened as Soviet 1st Guards and 3rd Guards armies broke through on a 150-kilometer front, advancing toward Milarovo and Morozovsk. These movements threatened the flanks and rear of Army Group Don, forcing Manstein to reallocate formations intended for the Stalingrad relief to the Upper Don to prevent a general collapse. The Luftwaffe's airlift became the next casualty of this strategic shift. Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk, the main transport hubs for flights into the pocket, lay directly in the path of the Soviet advance. By 23rd December, Soviet tank corps penetrated the airfield perimeter at Tatsinskaya. Ground crews and flight personnel fought from hangars and fuel depots while attempting to evacuate aircraft under fire. Around 60 Ju-52 and He-111 transports were destroyed on the ground. Others took off under machine gun fire with partial loads or wounded men. Loss of Tatsinskaya forced relocation of surviving transport units to Salsk and Novocherkassk, hundreds of kilometers farther from Stalingrad, reducing sortie capacity by nearly half. The average daily lift to the pocket dropped to less than 90 tons, a fraction of the required minimum. Soviet armoured raids continued toward Morozovsk, cutting the main rail link that supplied aviation fuel and spare parts. Inside the Stalingrad encirclement, consequences appeared immediately. Pitomnik airfield, the primary landing ground, came under constant bombardment. Soviet artillery, now positioned within 10 to 12 kilometers, shelled runways daily. Craters froze into ice pits, forcing engineers to regrade the surface with wooden planks and snow. From 24th December, aircraft could land only at intervals of 20 minutes, and unloading under fire often destroyed part of the cargo. The secondary strip at Gumrak was less developed and lacked lighting, making night operations dangerous. Casualties from air raids mounted among loading crews and medical staff. Wounded who had been promised evacuation waited in rows along the runway, many dying from exposure before boarding. German command attempted to preserve coherence by adjusting logistics within the pocket. Paulus divided the trapped army into 3 groups: north, south, and city sectors, each responsible for its own rationing and ammunition management. Yet stocks dwindled beyond recovery. Ration issues fell to 100 to 150 grams of bread per soldier per day. Horsemeat and frozen potatoes supplemented diets. Artillery units reported critical shortages of propellant. Some batteries fired only when targets were within direct line of sight. The onset of a snowstorm on December 25th coincided with intensified Soviet artillery fire, signaling the beginning of a new offensive phase aimed at crushing the pocket itself once the outer operations were secured. In the Kotelnikovo direction, Manstein ordered the 57th Panzer Corps to withdraw from the Mishkova line after assessing that further attacks were impossible. Soviet 2nd Guards Army, having held the crossings, counterattacked on December 24th to 25th, driving German forward elements back toward Kotelnikovo. By 26 December, the town was evacuated. The retreat was conducted under Soviet pursuit by the 51st Army and the 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps, who reclaimed the Aksay Valley and destroyed bridges to prevent renewed German use. German losses during the 2-week operation included approximately 25,000 men and over 200 tanks damaged or destroyed. the failure of Winter Storm ended the last realistic hope of a ground relief. Manstein informed Hitler that the encircled army could not be rescued without withdrawal orders, which were again refused. Stavka immediately sought to exploit the shifting balance. On 24 December, it authorized Operation Little Saturn's expansion into the Upper Don and Rostov sectors to sever all Axis connections between the Stalingrad Group and the Caucasus. The advance of 3rd Guards and 6th Army toward Milarovo threatened the German communications hub linking Army Group A in the Caucasus to Manstein's command. As these Soviet forces advanced westward, they enveloped remnants of the Italian and Hungarian corps and drove deep into the German rear. Army Group A, positioned far to the south in the Kuban and along the Terek, began withdrawing toward the Rostov gateway to avoid isolation. The initiative on the southern front passed decisively to the Red Army. In the Stalingrad area, the inner ring tightened. Don Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky assumed direct responsibility for the final reduction. Its order of battle on the 26th of December included over 30 rifle divisions, supported by 5 tank and mechanized corps, and a concentration of artillery exceeding 7,000 guns and mortars. Ammunition supply routes ran along repaired railways from the Volga crossings east of Stalingrad to forward depots in Gorodishche and Peskovatka. Preparations for the final offensive, codenamed Operation Ring, began immediately after Christmas. Soviet engineers marked assembly zones, and reconnaissance detachments probed German lines to identify artillery positions. The Red Army intended not a frontal rush but a methodical compression, eliminating resistance pocket by pocket. For German forces outside the encirclement, the priority shifted from relief to evacuation of threatened logistics zones. Luftwaffe engineers dismantled remaining installations at Morozovsk and moved the surviving aircraft to bases farther west. The supply corridor from the Don to the Caucasus became a chain of rearguard actions as Soviet mechanized formations advanced faster than German infantry could retreat. Entire transport columns were destroyed on frozen steppe roads when ambushed by T-30 foes. Railway evacuations overloaded the Rostov junction, where trains from the Caucasus competed with retreating army echelons. The southern wing of the Eastern Front, once designed for an advance into the Middle East, now fought to maintain a coherent line along the lower Don. Within the Stalingrad pocket, December 1942 closed in total isolation. Frost thickened to minus 30 degrees at night. Weapons jammed and fuel congealed in drums. Aerial deliveries now brought only high-value supplies, morphine, radio batteries, and message capsules, since bulk cargo could no longer justify the risk. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in German and Romanian. Leaflets detailed safe conduct guarantees, though few were trusted. Reports of starvation and illness increased. Units ceased to exist as tactical entities, merging into ad hoc battle groups commanded by the nearest surviving officer. Field hospitals lacked anesthetics. Operations were performed without heat or light. Amid this collapse, Paulus still transmitted formal situation reports twice daily, recording ammunition counts and ration levels with bureaucratic precision long after they had lost practical meaning. By the final week of December, the operational equilibrium established since November was gone. The encircled Sixth Army no longer functioned as an instrument of maneuver, but as a static, starving fortress. Manstein's forces, compelled to withdraw, faced the challenge of defending the lower Don against multiple Soviet fronts. Soviet command, meanwhile, had achieved the dual aim of destroying Axis coherence in southern Russia and preparing the ground for the liquidation of the Stalingrad pocket. The turning point had arrived, not in a single decisive battle, but in the systematic unravelling of an entire campaign's strategic framework. On 10th January 1943, Don Front opened Operation Ring with an artillery preparation calculated in minutes and sectors. More than 7,000 guns and mortars fired on designated rectangles along the western and northern faces of the pocket. Assault groups from the 65th, 21st, and 24th Armies advanced on a frontage measured in dozens of kilometers, methodically reducing strongpoints around Marinovka, Dmitrievka, and the state farms west of Gumrak. The plan avoided a single breakthrough thrust. Instead, it imposed progressive compression, isolating German regiments and compelling short withdrawals that consumed fuel and ammunition. Within the city, 62nd Army pushed outward from factory districts to split German street sectors and to deny interior maneuver between the Volga Bank and the Western Steppe. The air bridge failed in stages aligned with the loss of the pocket's airfields. Pitomnik, the principal landing ground, fell on the 16th of January after a combined assault by rifle divisions supported by direct-fire artillery. Until that day, daily sorties had alternated between 50 and 200 tons delivered, depending on weather. Afterward, landings ceased and only airdrops were possible. Gumrak, the last usable strip, was overrun by 23 January. From then on, wounded could no longer be evacuated, and supplies arrived irregularly in containers scattered by wind and burst patterns, many recovered by Soviet patrols. The change reduced the inflow to levels insufficient even for medical priority items. Units recorded final stocks in ledgers that effectively ended their capacity to conduct coordinated artillery fire or to mount sustained counterattacks. Donfront adjusted axes after each local collapse. On 15 to 20 January, 65th Army advanced from the northwest, taking the heights around Voroponovo and cutting the lateral road net that linked the northern and southern halves of the pocket. 21st Army seized settlements along the railway west of Stalingrad, while 24th Army pressed across open steppe toward Gumrak. The effect was to divide the encircled force into several compartments with limited communication. In the city, 62nd Army's narrow advances along ravines and factory walls reached the airfield approaches, further constricting movement. Soviet infantry moved with attached sappers and anti-tank guns, consolidating each block before proceeding to prevent local counterthrusts that had previously regained ground. German command measures focused on organizing defense by sectors and conserving remaining heavy weapons. 14 Panzer Corps and 51 Army Corps redefined boundaries along streams and railway embankments. Artillery was sighted for direct fire against assault guns and T-34s. Ammunition allowances for 105mm and 150mm howitzers dropped to handfuls of shells per gun per day. Frost and disease compounded attrition. Field hospitals at the former airfields received thousands of wounded without heat or anesthetics. Typhus cases rose among soldiers and civilians sheltering in cellars. Rations in many units declined to under 100 grams of bread per day, supplemented by horse meat when available. With air evacuation no longer possible, medical staff triaged by mobility and likelihood of survival. Civilian conditions deteriorated alongside the military collapse. Tens of thousands of inhabitants had been evacuated across the Volga during the autumn fighting, but those remaining in ruins near the front lived in dugouts and basements, sharing limited food stocks with troops or foraging at night. Shelling destroyed wells. Water was melted from snow. Soviet authorities established receiving points on the east bank for those who could cross under artillery cover. German medical reports inside pocket recorded growing numbers of civilian casualties from bombardment and cold. When attacking forces captured residential blocks, they organized immediate clearance of mines and distributed bread and hot water to residents gathered by local administrators and military patrols. As January progressed, the pocket split. On January 24th to 26th, Soviet advances along the railway and northern ravines severed the encircled force into a northern group around the tractor plant and a southern group centered on central Stalingrad and the airfield zone. German attempts to restore contact failed due to lack of fuel and the density of Soviet anti-tank positions on the intervening ground. Don Front concentrated artillery to eliminate each sub-pocket in turn. Forward observers established on captured water towers and factory roofs directed fire onto identified command posts and depots. The capture of ammunition stacks frequently determined the local tempo. Where shells were found intact, Soviet units accelerated, and where resistance stiffened around remaining heavy weapons, they paused to bring up additional guns. The final phase unfolded between 28th January and 2nd February. On 28th to 29th January, Soviet assaults penetrated the city centre. On 30th January, the German commander in the city was promoted, a formality that did not alter the operational situation. By 31st January, forces of the 64th and 62nd Armies reached the Central Command area. Staff officers and field police were taken prisoner alongside wounded and civilian personnel in underground shelters. Organised resistance in the southern pocket ended on January 31st. In the north, remnants around the factory districts, under separate corps command, held out for 2 more days without supplies. On February 2nd, surviving elements in the northern sector ceased fire. The clearing operations that followed focused on collecting weapons, securing dumps, and processing prisoners. Captures and casualties reflected the magnitude of the encirclement. Approximately 91,000 Axis personnel surrendered in early February, including more than 20 generals. Among them were thousands of wounded and frostbitten soldiers who could not be moved during the last week of fighting. Estimates of those encircled in late November, German, Romanian, Croatian and auxiliary units had reached around 290,000. Many were killed during the siege or evacuated earlier by air before the loss of the airfields. Soviet formations reported tens of thousands of prisoners taken during Operation Ring alone, alongside captured material, thousands of machine guns, hundreds of artillery pieces, and large quantities of small arms ammunition and rations. Soviet losses in the final reduction included infantry casualties from assaults on fortified positions and aircraft shot down while interdicting drops. The methodical approach limited exposure compared with a single continuous rush, but did not eliminate attrition. Prisoner handling followed established procedures under winter strain. Collection points processed captives by unit and rank. Wounded were separated for treatment by mixed teams of military and civilian medical staff. March routes led to camps east of the Volga and into the rear of the Volga and Urals districts. Mortality during the first weeks was influenced by exposure and disease, conditions similar to those experienced by Soviet prisoners earlier in the war, but occurring now in reverse. Records from the following years indicate that only a fraction of those captured in February 1943 returned after the war, with repatriations extending into the mid-1950s. Contemporary Soviet and German documents attribute non-combat deaths to malnutrition, epidemics, and the effects of prior wounds sustained during the siege. Outside the city, the withdrawal of German formations from the lower Don accelerated. The failure of the relief and the collapse of the airlift compelled Army Group Don to shorten its line to avoid a broader encirclement between the Don and Manych. Soviet mobile groups that had struck Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk continued west toward Milarovo, driving gaps between Axis corps and forcing evacuations of depots and repair bases. The retreat created secondary humanitarian effects. Transport columns mixed with refugee flows from steppe settlements, and food and fuel requisitions intensified in districts temporarily reoccupied by German units during their movement. With the end of organised resistance inside Stalingrad on February 2nd, combat operations in the immediate area ceased. The Red Army shifted engineer battalions to mine clearance and bridge repair, reopened river crossings for logistic traffic, and began salvage of captured equipment suitable for reuse. Medical services established large dressing stations along the East Bank and in recaptured neighbourhoods to manage wounded from both sides. Soviet command issued orders to reorganize assault armies for continued operations toward the Donbass and Rostov axes, while garrisons remained to secure the city and process prisoners and material. The withdrawal phase for the Axis, the reduction phase for the Soviets, and the humanitarian crisis for civilians converged in this period, closing the campaign that had begun as a 4-day envelopment and ended as a systematic dismantling of a trapped field army under winter conditions. Operation Uranus and the reduction that followed reshaped the war in southern Russia and altered the balance of initiative across the Eastern Front. The encirclement removed from the order of battle a field army that had anchored German operations on the Volga since September. The immediate military results were measurable. Approximately 290,000 Axis personnel were enveloped in late November. Around 91,000 surrendered in early February. The remainder were killed during the siege or evacuated by air before the loss of the airfields. Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies suffered losses that contemporary German and Romanian reports placed in the range of 150,000 to 200,000 killed, wounded, and captured during November-December. Material captured by the Red Army included thousands of machine guns, hundreds of field guns and heavy weapons, and substantial stocks of ammunition and rations that could be redistributed to assault units. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet, committed at levels beyond its peacetime design, lost a significant fraction of its serviceable aircraft and crews, with cumulative effects on air support along the entire southern sector. Strategically, the operation severed the link between the German summer objectives and the means available to hold them. After November 1942, Army Group A withdrew from the Caucasus to avoid isolation as Soviet thrusts advanced toward Milerovo and Rostov. The collapse of the Stalingrad air bridge and the failure of the relief from Kotelnikovo compelled Army Group Don to shorten its front along the lower Don and Manich. These movements ceded the initiative to the Red Army for the winter of 1942 to 1943. Subsequent operations, Little Saturn's expansion, Voronezh-Kastornoy, Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh, and the February-March push toward the Donbass and the Mios were made possible by the dismantling of German reserves created by the demands of Stalingrad. The Southern Front ceased to be a platform for further German advances and became a zone of managed retreat. Doctrinally, Uranus demonstrated that the Red Army had restored and adapted pre-war concepts of deep operations under wartime conditions. The essential features, artillery preparation with high tube density, shock echelons to rupture tactical zones, and mobile groups to reach operational depth, were executed with timetable discipline across 3 fronts. Maskirovka measures concealed force concentration and intent. A division of labor between inner and outer rings transformed a breakthrough into an encirclement capable of resisting counterstroke. German doctrine, which emphasized flexible defense and counterattack by concentrated armor, was undermined by simultaneous pressure on widely separated axes and by orders to maintain fixed positions in the city. The inability to mass a counterstrike force on either flank during the decisive 4 days illustrated the limits of maneuver when reserves are dispersed, and command priorities restrict withdrawal for operational regrouping. At the operational logistics level, the campaign quantified the capacity and limits of air supply. Staff calculations estimated that 6th Army required at least 300 to 350 tons per day to survive at reduced readiness and approximately 600 tons to sustain combat. Average deliveries after mid-December fell below 100 tons per day once forward transport bases were overrun, confirming that airlift could supplement but not replace ground lines for an army-scale force. On the Soviet side, the establishment of forward supply points within 10 to 30 kilometers of breakthrough sectors, rapid bridge repair on the Don, and systematic allocation of fuel to tank corps enabled exploitation to the Don crossings and subsequent defense of the Mishkova. Both sides confronted winter constraints, but the side whose plan linked expenditure tables to route segments and engineer tasks realized the intended tempo. Politically, the outcome affected coalition dynamics. Romania and Italy re-evaluated the exposure of their armies on the Eastern Front after heavy losses on the Don and Volga. German command structures adjusted with the creation of Army Group Don and subsequent changes in leadership and authority. But these measures did not reverse the material deficit. In the Soviet Union, the victory allowed leadership to present a narrative of regained operational competence and strategic initiative. The promotion of the German commander shortly before the end and the capture of senior officers became symbols within competing wartime information campaigns. Neither altered the military reality that a large encircled force had exhausted its means of resistance. Civilian and urban consequences were lasting. Stalingrad's industrial base and housing stock were destroyed across wide districts. Reconstruction began, even as the front moved west. Population movements during the siege, evacuations across the Volga, and returns after February created administrative and humanitarian tasks that absorbed local and central resources through 1943. The processing of tens of thousands of prisoners and wounded from both sides required expansion of medical services and transport eastward, while mine clearance and salvage work continued for months to make the area habitable and to recover usable materials. In military education and historiography, Uranus became a case study in encirclement under modern conditions. Analyses emphasize the value of choosing flanks held by Allied forces with lower anti-tank density, the importance of converging axes that aim at crossings and junctions rather than at a fortified city centre, and the requirement to convert breakthrough into containment through layered belts. Counter-analyses focus on alternative German courses of action, an early breakout while the corridor remained open, concentration of armour before November on the flanks rather than in the city, or a theatre-level withdrawal to shorter lines on the Don. Debates continue over the feasibility of these alternatives given fuel stocks, political directives, and the speed of Soviet exploitation. The longer-term operational consequences extended into 1943. The destruction of Sixth Army, the weakening of Allied armies on the Don, and the loss of transport aircraft reduced German options for the spring campaign. The Red Army, having proven a method for large-scale envelopment and siege, retained the initiative into the winter and spring, setting conditions for operations that culminated at Kursk in July. Equipment and organizational changes accelerated. Additional tank and mechanized corps were formed. Artillery armies and guards formations received priority in ammunition and transport. German panzer divisions reconstituted with altered tables that reflected attrition and the need to fight defensive battles across wider fronts. Memory and commemoration followed divergent paths shaped by state narratives and veteran testimony. Soviet accounts highlighted coordination between fronts, the role of artillery and engineers, and the systematic reduction of the pocket. German memoirs often traced the sequence of decisions that prevented breakout and the experience of siege life under air supply. For Romania and Italy, Stalingrad marked a turning point in public perceptions of the war's course and the risk of extended operations far from national bases. Academic studies in subsequent decades cross-compared staff documents, radio logs, and logistics ledgers to reconstruct a campaign in which planning arithmetic, tons per day, kilometres to crossings, anti-tank guns per kilometre, proved as decisive as tactical skill. In sum, the 4 days that closed the ring between the 19th and the 23rd of November initiated a chain of events that ended with the surrender on the 31st of January and the 2nd of February, and with a strategic realignment along the entire southern front. The operation's legacy lies in its demonstration that encirclement at army scale required not only a successful breakthrough, but also the capacity to hold against relief, that air power could not substitute for ground logistics at that scale, and that doctrine coupled with disciplined execution could convert numerical and geographic advantages into a decisive outcome. The consequences unfolded across military, political, and civilian spheres, shaping the trajectory of the war in 1943 and beyond.